The concept of layer masks in Photoshop is actually quite simple. The idea behind a layer mask is you add on this extra gauze onto a particular layer. So for instance, in my layer window at the moment, I see that my layer 1, the layer with the owl object, is selected, and I see that with a kind of a blue gaze behind it. To add on a layer mask onto that layer, I move along the bottom of the layer window, and third from the right at the bottom of that layer window, I see this object here that gives me a tooltip saying add layer mask over it. If I click on that, it just adds in that extra gauze, that extra layer mask beside the actual content of the layer, and I see that that layer mask is selected. The way that I know that that layer mask is selected, I see each of the four corners has this kind of black border around it, and I can switch between selecting the content of the layer and selecting the layer mask whenever I want. Now the concept behind the layer mask is that anywhere where a layer mask is white, for instance this layer mask here is white all over, it lets the content of that layer work completely normally. But anywhere where that layer mask is colored black, it stops that layer from working and it will let whatever is behind it shine through. So for instance, if I take a brush and I make sure that I'm on my black color and I move over my document window, I will see that it looks as if I'm going to be painting on the content of this, but because my layer mask is selected, it's actually going to paint black on my layer mask. And as I said, anywhere where a layer mask is colored black, it stops that layer from working in that area and lets whatever is in behind it shine through. Now at the moment my brush is very hard, so I'm going to take down the hardness of my brush to about 50%, and we'll see the effect that that has. Again, I'm drawing black onto my layer mask, so I see a slight softening in the edge there of my brush. Look what's happening over my layer mask though. I can see where the black has been painted on that layer mask, and it's stopping that layer from working in those areas. Again, if I want to stop the background from shining through and let the layer work again, I can just turn back onto my white as my foreground color and then paint it back in again. And so it's a very non-destructive way of stopping a layer from working in a particular area. Just on the back of that as well, obviously if it's white, it works completely normally. If it turns black, it stops it from working. Well, what if it's halfway between? What if it's grey? So if I bring up on my color palette here and I go for a grey, might make my brush a little bit bigger here, and then I'm going to click and drag across. And as you can see here, it stops the layer working in a quasi type of way because it's halfway between white and black, so it half stops it working, and we see half the layer on top and we see half the layer below. Another variation on that as well is with my gradient tool. If I use my gradient tool and I have it going between white and black, if I move out over my layer mask now and I click and drag to drag on that gradient, well, I can see the type of effect that it will have. I can put black at the bottom of that layer and it will slowly blend into white, so it stops the content of that layer working at the bottom half where the layer mask is black, and as it slowly blends into white on the layer mask, I see the content working again. So I get this slow blend between the object on that layer and what's behind it. Let me just try another gradient there and just stretch it out a little bit more slowly, a little bit more gradually. So I'll see a more gradual kind of fade of this object slowly come into the content of the layer. And that's a brief introduction to layer masks in Photoshop.